There is an ongoing conflict that many people refuse to recognize or even discuss, and it takes place in western Sudan, the region known as Darfur. What started as an anti-government uprising soon turned into a war, which led to the all-out genocide that currently infects Sudan like an incurable disease that seemingly will never go away. The best term to describe this conflict would be civil war, but they have had so many internal conflicts in Sudan they just refer to them as wars. The nomadic tribes of northern Sudan were searching for water, and they encroached too far to the south and were met with hostilities from the southern militia. The tribes pleaded with the government to assist their situation, but the government took the side of the militia. It's worth noting that the government and the militia are largely Arabic, while nomadic tribes are not. When the government backed the militia, many non-Arabs felt like the government was being oppressive to them, and so a revolt against the government ensued in 2003, and it's been pure hell ever since then. To understand this internal conflict, it may be necessary to understand a little bit about the history of Sudan. In the early 19th century, Sudan was colonized by Egypt, and then later by Great Britain, which maintained tight control over daily Sudanese life for nearly a century. Then in 1953, Egypt and Great Britain began to withdraw from Sudan and established a parliament for independent control, and in 1956, Sudan had that. Unfortunately, it had been absolute terror, coupled with immense instability, has made that life in the region excruciatingly hard. Overpopulation and drought have been plaguing that area ever since 1956, and aside from 10 years of relative peace, there's been nothing but conflict and hardships in Sudan. Most people from that part of the world grew up learning nothing else but violence as a way of life. There's been constant fighting for years, but only recently has the idea of genocide had any place there. When the United Nations proposed that they send a peacekeeping force into Sudan, President Omar al-Bashir mobilized his forces and sent them into the region. The reasoning behind doing this is simple. President al-Bashir felt threatened by any kind of outside force that could help the nomadic tribes. In other words, he does not want the nomadic tribes to be helped, because he despises them and the government-sponsored militia has been systematically killing them for years now. This led many people to believe that President Omar is conducting genocide in Sudan and that he must be stopped. However, reports and investigations conducted by the United Nations have found no evidence of intentions to commit genocide. That's interesting, especially when you think of how many people have died in this conflict. Over 500,000 people have been killed, and over 2 million have been displaced in nearby Chad. These numbers are staggering and are only estimations, but any time you have that kind of mortality rate over a few years in a country, it seems that genocide is one of very few options to explain it. Even without committing genocide, President Omar al-Bashir has been indicted on many charges of murder and crimes against humanity, so if he were held responsible for these crimes, he would spend the rest of his days locked up. Most likely he will never face trial by the United Nations for what he's done, so he will remain in Sudan, a prisoner in his own country, yes, but the thought that he remains basically in control of the Sudanese militia is a terrifying one indeed. The reason why al-Bashir has not been removed from leadership in Sudan is because no one in Sudan is strong enough to challenge him. An international community has not imposed stiff enough sanctions to warn a halt to the daily onslaught of suffering that inhabits western Sudan. The unilateral sanctions that have been imposed by the United States are targeted at 31 companies affiliated with Sudan, and although it's a good start, most experts agree that multilateral sanctions would be required to help bring an end to the genocide. These sanctions are not effective because they do not have the compliance of the European Union or China, which is a major trading partner with Sudan. Even though sanctions seem to have little effect on the Sudanese government based in Khartoum, there are relief workers there working to help deliver food and supplies to these people in need. If it were not for the sacrifice of these hardworking individuals, the situation in Darfur would be much worse. To say these people's sacrifice is probably an understatement if you consider what they go through day in and day out. Carjacking, ambushes that lead to looting, and kidnapping, as well as physical and sexual assault. In 2007, 131 humanitarian personnel were kidnapped and 12 aid workers were killed while working in Darfur. As many can imagine, it's very detrimental to the relief efforts in the region when the workers are under constant pressure from the government and the militia. For most of Sudan's existence, it's been at war with itself, and these civil wars seem never-ending. So achieving peace in the region would be a difficult task indeed, but if something is not done, then Sudan may be lost in a perpetual state of self-inflicting war. If something like this were to transpire, then Sudan could never hope to progress into the 21st century. If history can be used to measure the future in any way, and Sudan has a very bleak outlook, the constant suffering and internal conflict seems never-ending, and the political leadership in Sudan seems bent on creating a destructive environment for its citizens to live in. Does not make sense to any logical person, but when you attack innocent civilians, torture, rape, kill your own citizens, and then deny any relief to your subjects in need, then you as obvious you do not care about how you are perceived, and that's exactly what's happening to Sudan right now. President Omar al-Bashir is doing whatever he wants, whenever he wants to, and no one in this country tells him otherwise, out of fear of certain death, and your international community can only do so much. Trying to help someone that does not want help himself is proving to be very frustrating to everyone involved. When you're the president of a country like Sudan, you're responsible for everyone in your country, but al-Bashir seems to take little to no responsibility for any of his citizens. It's hard to blame the rebels for revolting against someone as corrupt and carefree as this man, and when you run a country like this, so one-sided, it's only a matter of time before you face the dire consequences of the lack of responsibility of running your country and caring for your people.